Hi, and welcome to the continuation of Chapter 8 of The Secret Team. Chapter 8 is the CIA, the cover story, intelligence agency, and the real-life clandestine operation. So I'm reading you the book to ensure that you have knowledge in what's actually going on with your government agency. We've made it to page 221, and we've been battled continuously throughout. However, we've battled as always, and we win every single time. So let's continue on with page 221. On this simple and clear point, the CIA protagonists have rebelled and argued and connived for almost 25 years. Through a succession of skillful internecine maneuvers, the CIA, while working within the ST and shielded by secrecy, and the systems and pressures that have secrecy make it possible to utilize, has been able to either plant heavy secrecy, make it possible to utilize, has been able to either plant people in the NSC who are really CIA agents or men who will work at their bidding, or to do so, brief and brainwash the NSC representative or his designated alternate so that he will believe the CIA explanation of what the law and the directives mean. This is why it has been important to read the Dullah's book line by line. The book is no more nor less than a final compilation of all the soothing syrup of old wives' tales Alan Dulles concocted and poured over the fevered brows of men in high office and high public and private position for 25 years. The book shows how the CIA has been sold to the inner staff of the government and to others, such as writers and commentators, businessmen and educators, both in this country and all over the world. One would like to speak as kindly as possible and to say that these misinterpretations that cropped up in this book were no more than mistakes, and that they can be attributed in part perhaps to ignorance of all the facts. But this could not possibly apply here. This cover story and fairy tale about the evolution of American intelligence had been fabricated by highly intelligent men, has been honed to a fine edge through years of skillful manipulation and practice. It is the result of ignorance or lack of comprehension. This cover story is the plan scheme of a team of people, men who wish to present the CIA as a benign and well-controlled organization operating under law and directive and doing nothing except intelligence, when for the most part and in actual practice is not. The agency is very much aware too that it cannot look back because fate is creeping up on it. The tremendous pressures on this country that have built up during the long tragic years of the conflict in Indochina are driving researchers, politicians, and other concerned Americans to search for the origins and sources of responsibility for that disaster. This is bringing them closer and closer each day to the curtain of secrecy that has effectively veiled these areas from sight far more than a decade. The pressure is now forcing agency and ST supporters to begin a serious program of rewriting history and a massive effort to protect and shield the agency while shifting the search into other avenues. We have already said that the work of Daniel Ellsberg and the number of people who helped him may have been the first major step in this effort. The released Pentagon Papers do much to portray the CIA as it would suppose to be, while doing all it can do to shift any censor of the CIA as an organization primarily concerned with the clandestine operations to the military, the National Security Council, and the White House. Now a second salvo has been favored in an attempt to go further along this same road for the purpose of whitewashing the agency, as the sometimes prestigious Foreign Affairs and Quarterly Review of the Council on Foreign Relations entered its 15th year. It has published an article entitled "The CIA and Decision Making" by Chester Cooper. The author is listed as the director of the International and Social Studies Division, Institute of Defense Analysis, Special Assistant to Avril Harriman in planning the U.S. negotiating position on Vietnam 66 to 67. Senior staff member, National Security Council 64 to 66, author The Last Crusade, American in Vietnam. The review does not add that he was and may still be a member of the CIA. The contribution to the current history is a most astounding bit of writing and reweaving of events. It appears to be phase 2, or at least a part of phase 2, of the whitewashing of the CIA in Indochina. This article is a most expert and ideal example of what is meant by saying that the CIA likes to see itself in front of as long as it can control the pen. It begins most suitably by pointing out that Dulles selected the motto, which is chiseled into the marble at the entrance of the building in Langley, Virginia, from the words of St. John: the truth shall make you free. Not set you free, but make you free. It's right in front of your face. And with this fresh in mind, the article goes on to say one of his, Alan Dulles' greatest contributions in nurturing the frail arrangements and he helped to create to provide intelligence support to Washington's top-level foreign policy makers. Then he gets down to a serious business of trying to show how ardently the CIA has worked during the Indochina conflict, wholly ignoring the other and major side of the houses. CIA clandestine operations and CIA member of the secret team. To set the stage, it dwells upon the responsibility of the CIA to turn out the national intelligence estimates. When Pravda has been scanned, the Road Watchers reports from Laos checked, the economic research completed. Pham Dam Dong's recent speeches dissected radar signals, examined satellite observations, analyzed an embassy cables read. The estimators set about their task. It is likely to be the best informed and most objective view the decision makers can get. They brood about the world's problems and project their views about how these problems are likely to affect national security interests. All of this is to laud the intelligence side of the house, and this praise is most deserved. However, the intelligence staff has had its problems, and in mentioning some, the article attempts to use them as a means of shifting some blame of other parties, as in following. The Office of National Estimates had a thin audience during the Johnson administration. In other words, if the Johnson administration did not take advantage of his excellent intelligence, then certainly the CIA can't be blamed for that befell that administration. Or at least this is what the author would like his reader to believe. Then, to enlarge the scope of his case, he adds Nixon's administration relegated the national intelligence estimates but a tiny fraction of the study's analysis, position paper, contingency plans, research reports, and memorandum generated by the large new NSC staff. Again, he implies that if the Nixon administration failed to heed the national estimates, it was its own fault and not that of the CIA. Having set the stage and prepared his case, he goes directly to heart of the matter. Most Americans concerned about foreign affairs have long had to accept on blind faith that our government takes pains to provide its highest officials with the best possible intelligence guidance, and then to squirm under our private suspicions that this advice is all too often regarded with indifference. Thanks to Daniel Ellsberg, those of us who have not seen a national intelligence estimate for many years or who have never seen one can address the matter with somewhat more confidence than we could have a few months ago. Although it probably did not cross Ellsberg's mind that when he released the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, he succeeded in doing what the agency on its own has rarely been able to do for many than 20 years. He made the CIA look good through the inhabitants of the pickle factory themselves would call a highly credible source. That'd be me. Highly credible source is me. To those well steeped in the ways of the real CIA, and unfortunately there are too few who are, the above statement fits the pattern. Here's an agency partisan praise Daniel Ellsberg. This is much to support our earlier contention that one of the real reasons these papers were delivered to the public was really on behalf of the CIA and the ST and not the other way around. Then the article goes on to say that the Pentagon Papers tell us little about what actually happened in the White House cabinet room. They do reveal much about the intelligence guidance made available to the policymakers. He's still working on the major premise in an attempt to show that everything the CIA did was right by showing from the included extracts how excellent its intelligence product was during those trying years. Let's look further into this propaganda. As an example is selected from among the many available. By midsummer, the issue of American support for Diem's fledgling and untried government was high in the NSC's agenda. The NSC was requested to prepare an estimate on the viability of a Western-supported anti-communist government in Vietnam. According to the Pentagon Papers, the National Intelligence Estimate of August 3rd warned that even with American support, it was unlikely that the French or Vietnamese would be able to establish a strong government and that the situation would probably continue to deteriorate. The NSC nevertheless recommended American aid for the frail and untried Vietnamese government, a recommendation that was soon followed by President Eisenhower's fateful letter to Diem offering American support. This estimate had since been validated, and it seems clear that the United States would now be better off if President Eisenhower had paid more heed to that warning and less to the strong pressures that were being exerted by his Secretary of State and hardline member of Congress. This voice of the CIA is saying that the CIA National Intelligence Estimate has long since been validated, and the United States would now be better off if the president had listened to it and not to the John Foster Dulles and hardline members of Congress. Remember, as we review the record further, that this NIE, as reported by Foreign Affairs, was dated August 3rd, 1954. During the same very period, when NIE were establishing a cover story for the clandestine of the CIA, the record shows that the Director of Intelligence, Alan Dulles, was working through his clandestine channels to keep knowledge of his activities from other officials of the government, and at this time to establish a vast clandestine operational presence in Indochina. To compound this deception, the Foreign Affairs article of January 1972 presents a bold attempt to further conceal the duplicity of the CIA by hiding these facts and at the same time blaming members of Congress, John Foster Dulles and President Eisenhower, for things that were being done not by them at all, but by Alan Dulles and his clandestine staff. There can be no other way to interpret this action to cover up the role of the agency during the early and formative years of the Indochina conflict than to expose it as a premeditated effort to rewrite and restructure history by hiding the operational role of the CIA under its intelligence. This is one of the most compelling reasons why secret intelligence and secret operations should not be placed under the authority of one agency. In spite of what the Office of National Estimates was saying during 1954 on January 30th, 1954, during a meeting of the President's Special Committee on Indochina, Dulles inquired if an unconventional warfare officer, especially Colonel Lansdale, could not be added to the group of 5 liaisons officers to which General Navarre had agreed. In other words, as early as January 1954, Alan Dulles was moving into the action of Indochina with his crack team of agents, among them Ed Lansdale. Then by April 5th, 1954, the conclusion of this report of this same presidential committee included the following. The United States should, in all prudence, take the following courses of action to give vitality in Southeast Asia to the concept that communist imperialism is a transcending threat to each of the Southeastern Asian states. These efforts should be so undertaken as to appear through local initiative rather than as a result of the US or UK or French instigation. This action was assigned to USIA, United States Information Agency. The State Department and the CIA, it was to be the job of the CIA, among others, to see that the concept of the threat to each of the Southeast Asian states was to be made to appear to be communist imperialism. This was a direct charge of a committee on which Alan Dulles served and is a blunt definition of how anti-communism is hoisted to the top of the mass whenever it is needed as a rallying symbol. As the theme of the transcending threat in Indochina, it was in the direct line of that later communist-supported War of National Liberation theme, and then the communist-inspired subversion insurgency theme of the Kennedy era. There can be little wonder why, in the minds of most Americans, South Vietnam is so intricately tied to the idea of communist subversion. Words such as the above show clearly the role of the initiative taken by the CIA in Indochina. As far back as 1954, even while the Office of National Estimates was saying otherwise, and while all this was going on, Admiral Radford, the chairman of the JCS, gave a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense which included the following extract. The JCS desire to point out their belief that from the point of view of the USA, with reference to the Far East as a whole, Indochina is devoid of decisive military objectives, and the allocation of more than choke in U.S. armed forces in Indochina would be a serious diversion of limited U.S. capabilities. This was the view of the top military men as presented at the time. Same time Dulles was sending his team into action there under the cover of military men. "Bite your tongue," he said. While this was happening, the Geneva Conference was underway, although the Foreign Affairs article chooses to heap blame on Foster Dulles. We should recall that Dulles had not attended that conference since its organizational meetings. In his place, he had sent his Undersecretary, Bedell Smith, who had been the DCI before he went to the Department of State. Certainly John Dulles, whose brother was the DCI and was principal assistant, was a former DCI, was well aware of the views of the Office of National Estimates on the one hand, and of the actions of the clandestine side on the House on the other. Then the Saigon military mission entered Vietnam on June 1st. Military only in the sense that it was a cover arrangement. The mission was to enter to Vietnam quietly and assist the Vietnamese rather than the French in unconventional warfare. The French were to be kept as friendly allies in the process as far as possible. The broad mission for the team was to undertake paramilitary operations against the enemy and to wage political psychological warfare. Later, after Geneva, the mission was modified to prepare means by undertaking paramilitary operations in the communist areas rather than to wage unconventional warfare. By its own statement of mission, its team was not to aid the French and was to wage a paramilitary campaign against the enemy. This left it with only one real mission to assist the new government, Ngo Dinh Diem, and Allen Dulles sent his clandestine team into South Vietnam in August of 1954, exactly the same month of the NIE, which the Foreign Affairs article says the CIA published as guidance for this country. Dulles' covert actions and his overt NIE were in direct conflict. He was saying one thing and doing another. There is only one conclusion that can be drawn from such writing, and it is derived from one or two alternatives. Either the author did not know what the existence of and the mission of the Dulles-directed Lansdale SMM team, or if he did, he was attempting to cover up the CIA role in such activity, which had more to do with the course of events in Indochina. Since that time than anything else done by any of the other participants, here again we see the ST at work. It is most interested in covering up its role in Indochina during the past 20 years, and in so doing, it is skillfully working to shift the blame wherever it can. It is trying to charge that if the military, the diplomats, President Eisenhower, President Johnson, and Nixon all had heeded its advice as contained in the national estimates, they would not have gotten this country into such trouble. Their efforts even go so far as to attempt to hide behind their intelligence positions by using the transparent Pentagon Papers. The Foreign Affairs article would have its readers believe that the NIE is the only real CIA and that such things as Saigon military mission, because it was called a military mission, will be discovered not to be the CIA at all. Oh, gosh, y'all are boring. We have been saying that the release of the Pentagon Papers by the former CIA agent and longtime associate of Edward G. Lansdale, Daniel Ellsberg, may have been opening attack by the CIA to cover its disengagement, not only from the physical conflict in Indochina, but also from the historical record of that disastrous event. Aww. That's so sweet. In this effort, the CIA appears to be trying to hide behind its own best cover story, and is only an intelligence agency, and that its fine intelligence work during the past 20 years on the subject of Southeast Asia is all that we could remember. All we should remember. Now we find in Cooper another CIA apologist using the Foreign Affairs Review to follow up the praise Ellsberg. In fact, Cooper's exhilaration in his task gets the better of him when he says, thanks to Daniel Ellsberg, he means it. This near endorsement of Ellsberg by a CIA writer in the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, and all the more significant when one learns that this council is supported by foundations which are in turn directed by men from the Bechtel Corporation, Chase Manhattan Bank, Cummins Engine, Corning Glass, Kimberly-Clark, Monsanto Chemical, and dozens others. Not long ago, the political scientist Lester Milbreth noted that the Council on Foreign Relations was not financed by government, works so closely with it that it is difficult to distinguish council actions stimulated by government from autonomous actions. And while we appreciate that Foreign Affairs states clearly that it does not accept responsibility for the views expressed in any articles signed or unsigned which appear on its pages, its record and especially its list of authors over the years from John Foster Dulles in its first issue speaks for itself. The whole plot thickens to the point of near hypocrisy when Cooper cites the August 3rd, 1954 National Intelligence Estimate. The same Pentagon paper from which he quotes also contains a report on the year-long activity of the Saigon military mission. This report, written by Edward Lansdale of the CIA, began in that same month of August 54 while the NIA was speaking despairingly of Ngo Diem Diem. The SMM was supporting that Diem regime during the days after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. This team and all of its efforts were CIA originated. CIA supported, CIA manned, and CIA directed. From 54 through 63, all American activity in Vietnam was dominated by the CIA, although Lansdale and his key men, such as Charles Bohannon, Lucien Conein, the U.S. go-between at the time of the Diem coup d'etat, Bill Rosen, Arthur Arundel, Rufus Phillips, and others were listed in the Pentagon Papers with military rank. They were all in the employ of the CIA and were operating as CIA agents. This is what the Pentagon Papers reveal as happening in 54 and 55. Now, the CIA would have us believe that it was an objective and blameless intelligence agency, although all through those horrible years of the Vietnam buildup. However, it was the CIA that hid behind its own cover and that the state in defense to fan the flames of the smoldering conflict, to add insult to injury. The CIA would have us believe that Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, the DOD, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon were all to blame because they would not read and heed their NIE. Where were the CIA officials of the clandestine sector when their own men were writing these national intelligence estimates? The big question is, if the national estimates produced by the intelligence side of the CIA were so good, then why didn't the men in the clandestine operations office read and follow the advice of their own estimates? Yes, the CIA likes to write about itself, and the CIA likes to have others write about it as long as they write it laudatory and skillful propaganda. How can the CIA rationalize the fact that at the very same time it was sending its most powerful and experienced team of agents into action in Indochina? After its success with Magsaysay in the Philippines, it was writing NIE for the president, saying exactly the opposite. It is alarming enough today to put the Ellsberg releases and the Cooper tales together, but what did the CIA have in mind in 54 when it was doing such disparate things? What did the CIA expect President Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles to believe? The NIE that said we couldn't win with the frail Diem regime, or the SMM clandestine operation that was designed to support the same Diem team regime? Or could it have been that they either did not know about the secret operation or were improperly briefed? This is the very heart of the matter. This is what this book is all about. To put this in another context, when Eisenhower was planning for the ultimate summit meeting in May of 1960, did the NIE say that all was going well and nothing should be done to upset the chances of success of what most important mission? And did the DDP come in with this briefing for the U-2 flight at the same time? Or perhaps was there an NIE and no briefing about the U-2? How did the ST handle that one? Or to carry this same theme over the early 1961, did the NIE correctly foretell that the Cubans would not rise up and support an invasion of so few troops without U.S. troops, air cover? And how did the DDP brief the secret operation to President Kennedy to perform an invasion operation that was patently diametrically opposed to the NIE? To drive home the point of this duality further, Cooper states, in November of 1961, shortly after General Taylor and Walt Rostow returned from their trip to Vietnam, recommending inter alia that the U.S. offered to introduce into South Vietnam a military task force, and NIE warned that any escalation of American military activity in Vietnam would be matched by similar escalation by Hanoi. The North Vietnamese would respond to an increased U.S. commitment with an offsetting increase in infiltrated support for the Viet Cong. Again, the intelligence directorate of the CIA plays a lily-white role. At about the same time of July 1961, the Pentagon Papers show that a report again by Edward Lansdale, at the time a brigadier general assigned to McNamara's staff and still as ever a strong supporter of the CIA, lists the very considerable amount of unconventional warfare resources of Southeast Asia which were supported by and operating under the CIA. These military and paramilitary forces added into the tens of thousands of armed men and were liberally supported by American men. American money and American equipment, all put in place under the direction of the CIA. The Deputy Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, General Cabell, had just ordered the CIA operated a United States Marine Corps helicopter squadron from Laos, where things had turned from bad to worse, into South Vietnam, where things were going to turn from bad to worse. They were flown into the Khmer Peninsula by Americans. At that time, General Taylor was special military advisor to President Kennedy and was the overt title. He was a CIA clandestine operations man, closer to Dulles than to anyone in the Pentagon. He was in the office later held by George Bundy and currently by Henry Kissinger, who, by the way, has long been a key spokesman for the Council of Foreign Relations. The helicopters had been obtained from the USMC, and there were no Marines in the organization flying them or on the ground. New York Times report of the Pentagon Papers, November 8th, 1961, page 148. They were flown into the Khmer Peninsula by Americans, and they were supported by Americans for the purpose of airlifting the Special Forces elite troops to Ngo Dinh Nhu for action against the citizens of the terrorized area. This was another example of what was going on in the covert field at the same time that intelligence was putting out an estimate to the contrary. We have Cooper to thank for the nice story and Ellsberg to thank for the not so nice story. Who was President Kennedy to believe, the man who came with the NIE or the man who came and to brief him about the tremendous clandestine and paramilitary operations? The secret team was responsible. Or did they tell the president about both? Today, the CIA would like us to believe that it had challenged the validity of the hallowed domino theory by advising Lyndon Johnson that, with the possible exception of Cambodia, it is likely that no nation in the area would quickly succumb to communism as a result of the fall of Laos and South Vietnam. Furthermore, a continuation of the spread of communism in the area would not be irreparable. In 1961, the same time as this quote, Maxwell Taylor, the White House spokesman of the clandestine side of the CIA, informed President Kennedy that the fall of South Vietnam to communism would lead to the fairly rapid extension of communist control or complete accommodation to communism in the rest of the mainland of Southeast Asia and Indonesia. The strategic implications worldwide, particularly in the Orient, would be extremely serious. In those days, Maxwell Taylor expressed more properly the views of the CIA than those of the DoD, where he was held in awe and suspicion after he returned from retirement to become a member of the Kennedy inside staff. General Taylor continued to espouse this view even after he moved to the Pentagon as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on January 22, 1964, in a memo to Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara. He said, a loss of South Vietnam to the communists will presage an early erosion of the remainder of our position in the subcontinent. Even though he had moved to the Pentagon, Taylor's memoranda on South Vietnam were written by the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activity, an office within the confines of the Pentagon, but an office that had been created to work with the CIA and which by that date had become a regular conduit for CIA through the action. Then McNamara picked up this same party line in his memo to President Johnson. At that time, his memorandum on the subject were written either by Lansdale or Bill Bundy, both CIA men. Of March 16, 1967, Southeast Asia will probably fall under communist dominance. All of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia, Burma, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, India, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. By now, everyone was putting all pressure possible on Johnson, and as noted, they used all the dominoes. Yet the CIA today would have us believe that they were only the voice of the DDI and not the DDP. Speaking through SACSA to Maxwell Taylor, thence to McNamara, with input from Bundy and Lansdale, and on to Rusk and Johnson. No wonder the CIA wants men like Cooper and Ellsberg writing for them. The final irony is discovered that when Cooper's story begins to pit the national estimates against other Ellsberg data in 64 to 65, he states that the NIE of late 1964 claimed that we do not believe that such actions against the North would have crucial effect on the daily lives of the overwhelming majority of the North Vietnam population. We do not believe that attacks on industrial targets would so exacerbate current economic difficulties as to create unmanageable control problems for the Hanau regime. Would probably be willing to suffer some damage in the country in the course of a test of wills with the U.S. over the course of events in South Vietnam. Then, as if to place the blame on the military, he adds, as the Pentagon historians note, this view had little influence on the contingency papers which emerged. The most remarkable thing about this paragraph from Foreign Affairs is that it is directly the opposite of the views presented in the Pentagon Papers as the William Bundy memo on actions available to the United States after Tompkin, which is dated August 11th, 1964. Bill Bundy was the first time no longer sitting in the Pentagon. He was working for the ST as Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. However, overriding that position, Bill Bundy was always the ready spokesperson and puppet in both the Kennedy and Johnson administrations for the CIA. He had been with the CIA for 10 years and was the son-in-law of Dean Acheson, who has been reported as of this writing to be in line for the position of editor in Foreign Affairs. It is utterly fantastic memo. CIA spokesman Bill Bundy listed pages of dirty tricks and increasing pressures that were to be brought to bear against Hanau, including the Rostow favorite tit-for-tat actions. By late 1964, military escalation had begun and the role of CIA did not diminish. It was just overshadowed by the greater military magnitude. The flames that the CIA and the greater ST had ignited were faced by the military. However, even when the huge force was never able to snuff them out, it just had to stand there and let them burn themselves out. Then the Cooper account presents Dr. Sherman Kent, the longtime chief of the Board of National Estimates, saying the nature of our calling requires that we pretend as hard as we are able that the wish is indeed the fact, and the policymaker will invariably defer to our findings. He finds that his associates concerned about their influence is misplaced. No matter what we tell the policymaker, and no matter how right we are and how convincing we will upon occasion disregard the thrust of our findings for reasons beyond our ken. If influence cannot be our goal, what should it be? It should be to be relevant with an area of your competence, and above all, it should be the credible. Sherman Kent is an old pro. He knows his business and is one of the very best in the field, and how strange the context of his foreign affairs essay must seem to him. While he did prepare these NIE, his own associates in clandestine operations, and his own boss, the DCI were fanning out over all of Southeast Asia under the cover of his professional expertise, not only oblivious and unheeding of his work, but making mockery of it. Such are the ways of the ST. When a national estimate is presented by the same house, this presents the collateral and usually opposite view as special operations. An agency pulls the rug from under the feet of its own best achievements, and the men responsible, when your government attacks you. Allen Dulles was wrong when he wrote 1948, along with Jackson and Correa, that the two broad functions of intelligence and special operations should be under the same name and in the same agency. There's nothing wrong with the NIE system and with men like Sherman Kent. Ray Klein and Bob Armory, the evil is on the other side, and in spite of the vigorous efforts of agency zealots who have attempted to rewrite the history of the past quarter century, we cannot but take some faith in these words of St. John that Alan Dulles chose for the entranceway of the new CIA building. The truth shall make you free. This attempt to warp the truth will not. It might also have been well if the agency and its disciples had reconsidered their own more appropriate choice for a motto: look before you leap. The American public and the world for which Arnold Toynbee speaks prefer truth. Part of the reason the Vietnam War began is because one of the clandestine, because this is what I saw in the video, is that they moved millions, I don't know if it was millions, but it was a lot of people from one part of the country to the other. If you missed that, that's the reason. Trying to destroy Vietnam from within. It was really bizarre. The next chapter is chapter 9, the coincidence of crisis.